My name is Elena Marsh, and I am 41 years old, and until 5 years ago I did not know a person could clap for something that ugly. There were 30 of us packed into my parents' dining room that night, elbow to elbow around a table meant for 12, because my mother never let a Sunday go by without turning it into an occasion. My father stood up at the head of the table, put both hands flat on the wood, and told me that if I would not give my younger brother another $40,000 to cover what he owed a sportsbook in Reno, then I was dead to him. Those were his exact words. Dead to me? He said it the way other men say grace, like it was something rehearsed, something he'd practiced saying without flinching. My mother started clapping first, then my Aunt Carol. Then almost the whole table, forks still in their hands, napkins still in their laps, applauding my father for disowning his daughter over a number with 3 commas, fewer than what I'd already quietly paid to keep that same brother out of collections 4 times before. I stood up and nobody stopped me, and on my way out my father grabbed the spare house key off the hook by the door and threw it at me. It hit my collarbone and fell on the porch, and I picked it up anyway, because some part of me still couldn't leave a key on the ground even when I was being told I no longer had a house to open with it. What none of them knew, what I did not even know myself that night, was that the key I picked up off the porch would be the only thing standing between this family and a safe none of them could legally open. Loud, without me. Not without me standing in the room. 5 years after my father slammed his hand on that table, a lawyer would sit across from my mother and my brother and tell them, calmly, in the flattest voice I have ever heard deliver bad news, that the estate could not be settled and the safe could not be opened until Elena Marsh walked through the door. And nobody in that family, not one of them, could tell you why. I'll tell you why. But we're gonna get there the long way, because that's the only way this story makes sense. If you're new here, this is the kind of channel where we tell quiet, true-to-life stories about families, boundaries, and the exact moment somebody finally stopped paying for a seat nobody ever really offered them. Before I go on, if you're the kind of person who's ever been handed a bill for someone else's mistakes and told it was your duty to pay it, stick around, because I think you're going to recognize a lot of this. Subscribe if you want, it helps the channel find more people like us, but only if this one earns it. I'll ask you something at the end, and I'd genuinely like to know your answer. Let me take you back further than that dinner though, back to a town most people have never heard of and never will. Colby Falls has a population of about 4,150 people, one blinking light where the highway crosses Route 9, and a diner called the Wagon Wheel that has served the same chicken fried steak since before my parents were born. My father, Walter Marsh, ran the hardware and feed store on Main Street for 34 years. The kind of place where farmers came in for fence posts and left 20 minutes later having also talked about the weather, their knees, and whatever the high school football team had done that weekend. Everybody in town called him Walt, and everybody in town liked him, which is a different thing than everybody in town knowing him. He kept a jar of butterscotch candy by the register for kids, refilled every Friday out of his own pocket, a detail half of Colby Falls could probably still tell you if you asked them, though almost none of them ever saw what he was like at his own dinner table. My mother, Vivian, ran the house the way other women run committees, with agendas nobody saw but everybody felt. She sang in the choir, cheered the harvest auction 3 years running, and had opinions about who deserved what, that she delivered with a smile so warm you didn't notice the verdict underneath it until later. I was the older one. My brother Dominic came along 3 years after me, and from the day he was born, something in the air of that house shifted in his favor. It wasn't cruelty, not at first. It was smaller than that. It was a bigger slice of cake at birthdays nobody else noticed was bigger. It was a 10-speed bike for his 12th birthday, while I rode a hand-me-down 2 sizes too small until I was 14. It was my mother telling relatives, in front of me, that Dominic was sensitive and needed protecting, while I was the strong one and could handle whatever life put in front of me. I didn't understand until much later that being called strong in that house was just another word for being told you'd be paying for it. I remember the exact moment I understood the shape of things in that house. I was 11 and I'd won a small county math scholarship, $200 and a certificate with my name spelled correctly for once, and my mother mentioned it to my grandmother over the phone in the same flat tone she used to report the weather. That same month, Dominic scored a single goal in a rec league soccer game that didn't even make the standings, and my mother threw him a party in the backyard with a sheet cake that said, "Our champion," in blue icing. I didn't say anything about it then. I just noticed, the way I noticed everything, and filed it away without a word, the same way I'd end up filing everything else for the next 25 years. There was another one a few years later, small in the way these things always are until you line them all up and see the pattern they make. I was 16 and had been saving for 8 months to go on a school trip to the state capital, $90 I'd earned babysitting for neighbors 2 towns over. 3 weeks before the trip, my mother told me the money needed to go toward Dominic's cleats instead, because his old ones had a hole in them and the season started that Friday. I didn't go on the trip. Dominic played the whole season in new cleats nobody ever thanked me for. I don't think either of my parents remembers that moment at all. I remember it the way I remember most things, exactly, down to the $90. I found my way into numbers early, mostly because somebody had to. By the time I was 15, I was balancing the books at my father's store 2 afternoons a week, because his handwriting was bad and his patience for columns was worse. He'd sit across the counter from me with a cigarette he wasn't supposed to smoke indoors, watching me reconcile the register against the day's receipts, and it's the closest thing I have to a memory of him being proud of me without an audience there to perform it for. I liked the work itself too. I liked the way a ledger didn't lie to you, didn't have moods, didn't clap for the wrong person at dinner. I liked that if the numbers didn't add up, that meant something was actually wrong, not just that somebody in the room had decided to feel a certain way about you. I studied accounting at the state school 2 hours from home, worked 2 jobs to pay for the parts my scholarship didn't cover, and eventually landed a job as a fraud examiner at First Cedar Bank, the kind of work where you spend your days finding the exact moment somebody started lying with a number. It turned out I already had a lot of practice reading that particular moment. I'd just never had a job title for it before. I met my husband Marcus the second year of college in a library that smelled like carpet glue, where he was the only person willing to share his highlighter with a stranger who'd forgotten hers. He was studying to be a paramedic. He grew up an hour outside Colby Falls in a house with even less money than mine, and he had a way of noticing people that I wasn't used to. The first time he came home with me for a weekend, my mother served him leftovers on a chipped plate while Dominic got the good china, and Marcus never said a word about it to my parents. He waited until we were back in the car, and then he asked me one question, quietly, without any heat in it at all. He asked if that happened a lot. I told him I didn't know what he meant, because at 20 I still didn't have language for what I'd been living inside my whole life, and he just nodded and let it sit, and didn't bring it up again until years later when I finally had the words myself. He just started, quietly, showing up for me in ways nobody in my own family did. That became a pattern that ran under the whole rest of this story, so I want to name it now, because it matters later. While my own blood was teaching me what I was worth to them in dollar amounts, Marcus was teaching me something else entirely, mostly without speaking, mostly just by being there. The first time my parents asked me for money, I was 25. Dominic was 22, a year out of the community college he'd dropped out of, and he owed a friend of a friend $6,380 from a card game that had gotten out of hand. My mother called me on a Tuesday night, her voice doing the thing it always did when she wanted something, warm at the edges and firm in the middle. She told me Dominic was in trouble, real trouble, the kind of trouble where men show up at your apartment if you don't pay. She told me family takes care of family. She told me, and I remember this phrase exactly because she would say some version of it to me at least half a dozen times over the next 11 years, that we take care of our own. I asked her, that first time, whether my father knew she was calling me instead of going to the bank herself. She said the bank wouldn't understand, and family would. I didn't push on it further. I was 25, and some part of me still wanted very badly to be the daughter who came through. I wired the money the next morning. I didn't tell Marcus how much it was, not that first time, because I was embarrassed, though I couldn't have told you exactly what I was embarrassed about. I just knew I didn't want to see his face while I did it. He found out anyway, 3 weeks later, when he saw the transfer on our joint statement, and he didn't say a single accusing word about it. He just asked if I was okay. I remember that being the wrong question and exactly the right one at the same time, because nobody had ever asked me that in relation to my family's money before. Everybody else only ever asked whether Dominic was okay. I started keeping a folder that same week. Not because I thought I would need it someday. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to tell you I was building a case against my family from the very beginning, and that isn't true. I kept the folder because keeping records is what I do. It's the same instinct that makes me good at my job, the same instinct that makes me double-check a receipt at a restaurant even when I know the math is probably right. I labeled the folder in blue ink on a plain manila cover, no name on it, just a date. Inside I put the wire confirmation, the date, the amount, and one line about what it was for. I didn't know yet that folder would end up being called Exhibit A by a lawyer someday. I just knew that somewhere in me, a part that had been keeping score since I was a kid, getting the smaller slice of cake, wanted a written record of what this family actually cost. If you've ever been the one who quietly kept the receipts while everyone else got to forget, I want you to comment and tell me what you kept. A folder, a bank statement, a group text you never deleted. I read every single one of those comments, and they're a big part of why I started telling this story at all. The second time was 2 years later. Dominic had moved to a bigger city an hour south, chasing a girlfriend and a bartending job that never quite covered his rent. And this time it wasn't cards, it was sports betting, football season specifically, and the number was $11,975. My father called that time, which surprised me, because my father almost never called. He was a man who let my mother do the talking in every room they ever stood in together, content to nod along a half beat behind her, and hearing his voice on the other end of the line felt strange enough on its own that I almost didn't register what he was asking for. He told me Dominic had learned his lesson. He told me this was the last time, and I remember him saying it slowly, deliberately, like a man trying to convince himself as much as me. He used the word promise, which I would later learn from my father meant almost nothing, the way some men's apologies mean almost nothing, a sound their mouth makes to close a conversation rather than a commitment their actions back up. I asked him before I hung up whether he and my mother had considered not paying this time, letting Dominic sit with the consequences on his own. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "That wasn't really an option in this family," and I remember thinking, even then, that the word option was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I paid it. I added the wire confirmation to the folder. And two, I want to tell you about the space between the bailouts too, because that's where the real damage happened, in the quiet parts nobody ever puts in the highlight reel of a family falling apart. In those years I got promoted twice at First Cedar, first to senior examiner, then to lead a small team investigating check-kiting schemes across 3 branches. I passed my certification exams on the first try, both of them, something I never once heard mentioned at a single family dinner, though Dominic getting hired as a bartender at a chain restaurant got its own round of applause at Thanksgiving that same year. Marcus and I got married in a backyard with 40 folding chairs and a taco truck, because that's what we could afford. And my mother spent the entire reception telling relatives about how Dominic's girlfriend's family had rented an actual venue for their engagement party the month before, the kind with a chandelier and a coat check. I always noticed, but I told myself that's just how my mother was, and that noticing wasn't the same as it mattering. Marcus noticed differently. Every single Sunday for the first 6 years of our marriage, rain or shine, whether we'd visited my parents that week or not, he drove 2 hours round trip after his shift to bring me a plate of green chili chicken enchiladas his own mother had taught him to make, wrapped in foil, still warm, because he knew Sunday dinners at my parents' table left something hollowed out in me that needed filling back in. He never once asked me to explain why. He just showed up with the plate. Item 3 came when I was 29. Dominic had cycled through 2 jobs and a stint doing something vague with online trading that turned out to be, once I looked at the statements he reluctantly showed me, mostly casino apps disguised with different branding, the icons redesigned to look like stock tickers if you didn't look too closely. $9,240. This time to cover an overdraft that had triggered a threat of eviction. My mother's line that time was different. She told me that if Dominic ended up homeless, it would be on my conscience, not hers, because I was the one with the money to prevent it. I asked her, once, why it was never on my father's conscience, since he technically had savings of his own. She told me that wasn't a fair question to ask a mother who was worried sick about her son. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage at work after that call, not crying, just sitting very still, doing the thing I do under stress, which is count. I counted the ceiling tiles in the parking structure, 41 of them in a row, directly above my windshield. I don't know why I remember that number more clearly than I remember most conversations from that year, but I do. If you've ever had a family member imply that someone else's crisis is automatically your financial responsibility just because you happen to have savings and they don't, I'd like to know how you finally said no, or whether you ever managed to. That question sat unanswered in my own life for a long time, so tell me in the comments if you found your version of an answer before I found mine. Item 4 was $18,650, and it came with a new development. My father drove to my house to ask for it in person, sat at my kitchen table with his hat still in his hands, and told me that Dominic had a gambling problem, an actual diagnosis, a real name for what was happening given to him by a counselor at a clinic 2 counties over. For one afternoon, I let myself hope that meant something was finally going to change, that the money this time was for treatment and not for debt. My father even used the word turning point, which was not a phrase I'd ever once heard him use about anything. It was for both, in the end. Half went to a counselor. Dominic saw exactly 3 times before deciding the drive was too far. Half went, I found out 8 months later from a bank statement Dominic left open on a shared family laptop, to an online poker site with a green 4-leaf clover for a logo. The kind of detail that would almost be funny if it hadn't cost what it cost. Item 5 was $27,400. I was 32, 6 years into my marriage, 2 years into leading my own team at First Cedar, and by then the folder wasn't thin anymore. I'd started adding a running total at the front, updated by hand each time in the same blue ink, the way you'd track anything else you needed to understand the shape of. Not because I was planning to use it against anyone. I want to say that again because it's true and because I think people assume the ledger was always a weapon. It wasn't. It was the only place in my life where the truth of what this family cost me existed in writing, instead of just living, unspoken, in the tightness in my chest every time my mother's name showed up on my phone. Marcus was the only person who ever saw that folder in those years, and the only thing he ever said about it every single time was some version of the same sentence. He'd ask if I was doing this because I wanted to, or because I was afraid of what happened if I didn't. I never had a clean answer for him. I'm not sure I have one even now. What I do know is that he never once told me to stop. He never once told me I was being foolish, or weak, or naive, the way I sometimes told myself in the middle of the night after a wire transfer went through. He just kept asking the same quiet question, patiently, year after year, the way you'd check a smoke detector, not expecting an answer to change anything that day, just wanting the question to stay somewhere in the room where I could find it again when I was finally ready to hear it. Item 6 was $34,900, and it came with the closest thing to a real conversation Dominic and I ever had about any of it. He showed up at my house alone, no parents this time, sat on my front step because he said he didn't feel like he'd earned the right to come inside, and he cried, and he told me he hated himself, and he told me he understood if I said no, that he'd understand and he wouldn't blame me one bit. For about an hour, sitting on that step with him, I believed him completely. I wired the money the next day anyway, against every instinct I had, because some sister-shaped part of me still wanted, more than I wanted to be right, for my little brother to be okay. Marcus didn't say anything when I told him that time either. He just made 2 plates of dinner instead of reheating leftovers, and set mine down in front of me without a word, which by then had become its own kind of sentence between us. 11 years. 6 documented payments before the dinner, $108,545, item by item, sitting in a blue folder in a fireproof box in my closet, next to the marriage certificate and the deed to a house my parents didn't know I owned outright by then. Because by then, Marcus and I had built something of our own, quietly, the way you build things when you've learned not to announce them at family dinners. I never once brought the folder up at a family gathering. I never once used it to argue. I just kept it. The way you keep a smoke detector battery fresh, hoping you never actually need to find out if it works. Somewhere in those years, without my family ever once asking, I'd become the kind of person banks hire specifically to catch other people lying about money. I'd testified in 2 fraud cases by then, once for the prosecution in a case involving a car dealership that had been falsifying loan applications, and I trained junior examiners on how to read a pattern of small, escalating withdrawals as the signature of someone who is either in trouble or is trouble. I never once said out loud, not even to Marcus, that I recognized the pattern from my own family's phone calls, 6 calls, each one bigger than the last, each one following the exact same emotional script my training manuals would have flagged as a red flag in anyone else's life. You don't have to say a thing out loud for it to be true. There's one case from those years I still think about, a small business owner 2 towns over who'd been quietly draining his company's account to cover a nephew's debts. 6 withdrawals over 4 years, each one bigger than the last, each one justified in the ledger notes with some version of the word family. I remember sitting across from him during the interview, watching him explain the pattern back to me as if it were reasonable, as if anyone hearing it laid out in order wouldn't recognize exactly what it was. I didn't tell him I recognized it. I just wrote my report, in order, dated, total at the bottom, the same way I'd eventually lay my own family's numbers out on a lawyer's conference table years later. It's strange, the way you can spend a career naming a thing clearly in other people's lives and still take over a decade to name it in your own. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever watched a sibling get chance after chance while you got the bill, I want to hear about it, and I mean that. Drop a comment and tell me the number, if you remember it. I remember every one of mine. Which brings us back to that dinner, because I told you at the start where this was going, and now you know what came before it. Stay with me for this next part because it's the one I've told the fewest times out loud, even to people who already knew most of the rest. I was 36. Dominic was 33. He'd racked up a debt with an actual sportsbook this time, not a friend of a friend, not an app with a clover on it, an operation with people who called and texted and eventually, according to Dominic, showed up outside his apartment building. The number was $40,000. My mother had planned the dinner for a Sunday when half the extended family would already be in town for my cousin's confirmation, which I understand now was not a coincidence. She wanted an audience. She wanted the ask to happen in a room full of people who would make it harder for me to say no. My father stood up before dessert was even served, still holding his napkin, and the room went quiet the way rooms only go quiet when everyone already knows what's coming. He said Dominic needed the money by Friday, or there would be consequences he wouldn't describe in front of the kids at the table. He said it was time I did my part, that a family that size, 30 people around one table, didn't function unless everyone carried their share. Aunt Carol nodded along like he was reading from a hymnal. He said, and I want to give you this exactly the way he said it because it's the line that ended everything. You've had 11 years to prove you're part of this family. Give him the 40,000 or you're dead to me. I said, no. I said it quietly, the way I say most things, and I told the table in front of 30 relatives who had eaten my mother's pot roast without a single one of them asking what I'd already given, that I had paid $108,545 over 11 years, and I was done being the family's line of credit. Nobody gasped at the number. Nobody asked if it was true. My father slammed his hand on the table so hard the water glasses jumped, and he told me I was dead to me, present tense, like he needed to make sure everyone heard it land twice. My mother started clapping. I watched relatives I'd known my whole life, people who'd held me as a baby, put their forks down and applaud a man for throwing away his daughter over a debt that wasn't even mine. I stood up. I didn't yell. I didn't cry, not there, not in that room. I said goodnight to no one in particular and walked to the door, and that's when my father grabbed the spare house key off the hook, the one that had hung there my entire childhood, and threw it at me. It hit my collarbone. I picked it up off the porch anyway, put it in my coat pocket, and drove home in silence while Marcus, who'd come with me that night and watched the whole thing from 3 seats down the table, reached over in the car and just held my hand without saying a word for the entire 2 hours home. I counted the silence in that car too. Not because I wanted to, because that's what I do. It was quiet for 47 minutes before either of us said anything at all. I did not see my parents again. Not once. Not at Christmas, not at any birthday, not when Marcus's father passed away 18 months later and half of Colby Falls came to the funeral, except my own mother and father, who sent a card with a printed verse in it and nothing handwritten underneath. I heard about my family secondhand after that, the way you hear about people you used to know from someone at a gas station, or from Renee, who kept in touch out of what I think was genuine kindness rather than gossip. I heard Dominic had a new job. I heard my father's hands had started shaking sometimes at the store, and that he'd hired a part-time clerk to cover the register on days it got bad. I heard my mother had stopped mentioning me at all to anyone, which somehow hurt worse than hearing her mention me badly. Colby Falls is small enough that a thing like that dinner doesn't stay inside a dining room for long, and by the following spring I'd hear, second-hand and badly garbled, versions of what had happened at that table that barely resembled the truth. Some of them making my father sound like a man defending his family's honor, a few of them, from the kinder corners of town, quietly suggesting they'd always wondered about that boy and his debts. I stopped going into the wagon wheel on my rare visits back to see Marcus's mother, not because anyone was ever unkind to my face, but because I didn't want to find out which version of the story the woman refilling my coffee had heard. I saw my mother once, in those 5 years, entirely by accident, in the parking lot of a pharmacy in the next town over. She was loading a bag into her car and looked up and saw me for maybe 2 full seconds before she got in and drove off without a single word passing between us. I stood there afterward longer than I meant to, keys in my hand, trying to decide what I'd expected to feel and not quite finding it anywhere in my chest. Marcus, who'd been waiting in our own car, didn't ask me what happened when I got back in. He just reached over and turned the radio down a little, the way you do for someone who needs the world quieter for a minute, and let me have the silence for as long as I needed it. That day, it was 6 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard the entire time, unable to stop myself. I kept the key on my ring the whole time. I told myself a dozen times I'd cut it off, throw it out, stop carrying around a piece of metal from a house that had made it very clear I wasn't welcome in it. I never did. I couldn't have told you why back then. I can tell you now. 5 years passed like that. Quiet ones, mostly. I got promoted again, to lead a fraud investigations team of 11 examiners. Marcus finished his paramedic certification and started teaching part-time at the community college. We bought a house of our own, a small one, nothing my mother would have bragged about at a church potluck, but ours, paid for with money nobody in my family had ever seen a receipt for. We didn't have children yet, not because we didn't want them, but because for a long time neither of us felt steady enough to bring a kid into a life that still had a family-shaped hole in it we hadn't figured out how to talk about. Then, on a Tuesday in March, 5 years and 2 months after that dinner, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, a local area code I hadn't seen in years. It was a lawyer named Priya Osei, calling to tell me that my father, Walter Marsh, had died 2 days earlier of a heart attack in the back office of the hardware store, at his desk, sometime after closing, alone, found the next morning by the part-time clerk he'd hired for exactly this kind of bad day, except it turned out to be the worst one. She told me the funeral had already happened, quietly, family only, 3 days after he died, which told me everything I needed to know about how my mother still thought of me 5 years later. I sat with that for a moment. The specific cruelty of a woman waiting less than 72 hours to bury my father rather than risk having to see my face at the service. And then Priya told me the second thing. The thing that made me sit down on my own kitchen floor with the phone still pressed to my ear. She told me my father's will contained an unusual stipulation. There was a safe in his home office, a physical floor safe he'd installed himself years ago, that could not, under the terms of the will, be opened for inventory or distribution unless I was physically present in the room. Not my mother, not Dominic, me, specifically, named by full legal name, with language the lawyer described as unusually deliberate for a man who wasn't a lawyer himself. She told me my mother and brother had already tried, twice, to have the safe opened without me, and twice the request had been denied because my father's instructions were airtight in a way that suggested he'd thought about this for a very long time. I asked her the only question that mattered to me right then. Asked her why? She told me she didn't know. She told me my father hadn't explained it to her either, only that he'd been very specific and very calm the day he signed the amendment 11 months before he died. If you're the kind of person who's ever gotten proof, real proof, that somebody loved you in a way they never once said out loud while they were alive, I need you to sit with me on this one because I'm about to tell you what was in that room, but you should know that for about 2 weeks after that phone call, I didn't sleep well at all, turning that question over and over. Subscribe if this is the kind of story that gets under your skin the way it got under mine. I promise the ending earns it. Here's what I didn't know yet, sitting on my kitchen floor with the phone still warm against my ear. 3 days after that call, my cousin Renee, who'd been at the confirmation dinner 5 years earlier and had clapped along with everyone else before quietly becoming the one relative who still occasionally texted me on my birthday, accidentally added me to a family group text meant for people who were, apparently, still speaking to my mother. I don't think she meant to. I think she was scrolling through old contacts trying to find someone else and hit my name by mistake, the way you do when you're grieving and not paying full attention to your own phone. I saw 11 unread messages appear all at once before I even opened the thread properly, notifications stacking on my lock screen faster than I could read them, and one line stopped me cold, sent by my mother 2 days before Renee's mistake, time-stamped at 9,004 in the morning, the kind of hour when a person has already decided something before they've had their first cup of coffee. It said, "Make a list of everything Dominic owes right now, be specific with numbers, she's a numbers person, she'll want proof before she agrees to split it fairly." Underneath it, Dominic had replied with a figure. $62,000. New debt. 5 years of silence, and the very first thing my family did upon finding out there was money on the table was start drafting an invoice, addressed to me, before I'd even walked into the lawyer's office. I didn't respond in the group chat. I took a screenshot, the same instinct that had built the blue folder 11 years earlier kicking in without me even deciding to let it, and I sat with my phone in my lap for a long time afterward, not angry exactly, more like someone confirming a diagnosis they'd already privately suspected. I called Priya Osei back the next morning and asked her, plainly, what my legal position was. She told me I had every right to attend the reading and the safe opening on my own timeline, that nothing could force my hand on distribution, and that whatever was in that safe was, until I chose otherwise, mine to see before anyone else's. She also told me, gently, that in 22 years of practicing estate law she'd never once seen a will stipulation quite like the one my father had written, and that whatever his reasons were, he had clearly wanted to make certain I'd have the room to myself before anyone else's expectations entered it. I told her I wanted the meeting held at her office, not my mother's house, not the store, Lutro ground. She said that was unusual, but entirely within my right to request, and she scheduled it for the following week. I brought the blue folder. 11 years, 6 items, $108,545, $148,545 if you counted the $40,000 I'd refused. I brought Marcus. And I brought the spare key, which had never once left my keyring in 5 years, though it had taken me until that week to admit to myself why. The lawyer's office was a converted house on the edge of downtown, the kind of neutral, slightly too quiet room that makes everyone in it a little more careful with their voices. Priya's assistant, a young man named Theo, met Marcus and me at the door 20 minutes early, took one look at my face, and quietly brought me a glass of water without being asked, then told me, out of nowhere, that whatever was waiting in that room, I looked like someone who already knew exactly who she was, which was more kindness than most of my own relatives had managed in 5 years combined. I thought about that small, unremarkable moment more than I probably should have since. My mother arrived 12 minutes late in a black dress she hadn't worn to my father's actual funeral, according to Renee, and Dominic arrived with her, thinner than I remembered, in a jacket that looked like it belonged to someone else. My mother hugged me first, before a single word had been said, the kind of hug that assumes forgiveness has already been granted just because 5 years have passed. I let it happen for exactly 4 seconds. Ew, I counted them. Then I stepped back. My mother opened before Priya had even finished laying out the paperwork. She said she was so glad I'd come, that this was exactly what the family needed. A chance to come back together and do the right thing. Her voice already sliding into the same warm managerial register I remembered from every phone call that had ever cost me money. She said we should think about splitting things fairly, evenly, the way a real family would, and that surely I understood Dominic needed a fresh start more than either of us needed to dwell on old business. And then she said it, the phrase I'd been hearing in one form or another since I was 25 years old. We take care of our own, Elena. That's what your father would have wanted. I let a few seconds pass before I answered her. 9 seconds, by my own count, long enough that I watched her smile start to falter before I said a single word. I've learned, in 11 years of interviewing people about money they've lied about, that silence does more work than a raised voice ever will. I opened the folder on the table in front of everyone, laid the pages out in order, and I read them the way I read a suspicious wire history back at First Cedar, flat, sequential, without editorializing, letting the pattern say what it needed to say on its own. Item 1, 25 years old, $6,380, a card game debt to a man whose name I still remembered. Item 2, 11,975, an overdraft in a city an hour south. I went through all 6, in order, out loud, watching my mother's expression change with each figure, watching Dominic stare at a spot on the table that never moved, ending on the number that mattered most. $108,545 paid, documented, wired from my own account over 11 years, before the night my father called me dead to him for finally saying no to a 7th ask. Then I put the screenshot from the group chat on top of the stack, the one where my mother told Dominic to prepare a specific number because I was a numbers person who'd want proof. $62,000, freshly owed, 5 years after I'd been disowned, waiting for me at the door like nothing had happened at all. Nobody at that table asked me to confirm a single figure. They knew, the way you know a debt is real, the moment someone finally says the total out loud in a room you can't leave. My mother's face did something I'd never once seen it do in 41 years of watching it perform for other people. It cracked. Just for a second. She put her hand over her mouth, and when she spoke again her voice had lost the warm, managed edge it always carried in front of an audience. She said, I was afraid that if I didn't back your father that night, everyone at that table would see what a mess we'd let Dominic become. Standing behind your father was easier than admitting we'd failed as parents in front of 30 people. For about 4 seconds, I believed I was looking at the first honest thing my mother had said to me in over a decade. Then, just as fast, she reset. She sat up straighter, smoothed the front of her dress and said, But you were always the strong one, Elena. You never needed us the way he did. As if being strong had ever once excused what they cost me. As if needing less love than my brother meant I'd been owed less of it. I told her I wasn't there to relitigate the dinner. I told her I was there because a lawyer had informed me my presence was legally required to open my father's safe, and that once that was done, I would decide, on my own, what if anything I owed this family going forward, and that the answer, as of that morning, was nothing. She started to say something else, about family, about how her own mother had raised her to believe blood came before pride, and I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that she'd raised me on the exact same lesson and I had learned it. I'd just learned a different half of it than she meant to teach. She was the one who wrote the demands. I was the one who kept the receipts. Dominic didn't say much through any of it. He sat very still, staring at a scuff mark on the table that never moved, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly, the way they used to before he'd asked me for money, a tremor I recognized immediately and hated recognizing. I didn't ask him about the $62,000. I didn't need to. The number spoke for itself, the same way all the others had. At one point he looked up at me, just once, and something in his face wasn't calculation at all, just something closer to shame, though I couldn't yet tell whether it was shame about the debt or shame about the text message his mother had asked him to draft. Maybe it was both. I didn't ask that either. Priya walked us into the small back room where the safe had been moved after the store's contents were inventoried. A squat black floor safe my father had apparently installed himself 20 years earlier, bolted into the concrete, the paint on its door chipped in the same spot I remembered from childhood, back when it had sat in the corner of his office holding nothing more dramatic than store deposits and the deed to his truck. I knelt down in front of it, my knees on the same cold floor I'd swept 100 times as a kid, and took the spare house key off my ring for the first time in 5 years. It didn't fit the safe's keyway at all. My mother made a small, sharp sound behind me, somewhere between confusion and alarm, when the key instead slid perfectly into a small brass lockbox sitting on top of the safe, one nobody else in the room had noticed, tucked behind an old fireproof document case with a thin layer of dust across the lid. My father hadn't given me the key to the safe. He'd given me the key to something smaller, something private, something meant only for me, all along. Inside the lockbox was a letter in my father's handwriting, 3 pages, dated 11 months before he died, the same week he'd amended his will. There was also a deed, paid in full, to the house on Birch Street, the little rental house he'd inherited from his own mother, the exact same house whose spare key he'd thrown at me that night, retitled solely in my name 18 months after the dinner, long before he'd ever spoken to me again. And underneath both, there was a second folder, plain manila, no name on it, just a date, identical almost exactly to the kind I'd kept my whole adult life. Inside it, in my father's own handwriting, was a private ledger of every payment Dominic had ever asked our parents for directly, going back even further than mine, numbers I'd never seen, evidence that my father had been quietly keeping his own record the entire time, alone, the same instinct passed down to me without either of us ever knowing the other had it. The letter said what he'd never once managed to say out loud in 40 years of being my father. He wrote that he'd meant what he said that night, in the moment, the way a man means something when he's too afraid of the room to say anything else. He wrote that your mother needed me to hold the line in front of everyone, and I was too much of a coward to hold a different one. He wrote that within a year of that dinner he'd started tracking Dominic's debts on his own, quietly, in a notebook he kept in the store's back room where your mother never went, and that somewhere in those numbers he'd finally understood what he'd let me carry alone for over a decade, the exact shape of it dollar for dollar. He wrote that he'd driven past our old house on Birch Street more times than he'd ever admit, thinking about the two of us, before he finally decided what to do with it. He wrote that he could not undo the dinner, and he was not asking me to forgive him for it. That some things a man does, you don't get to walk back just because you're sorry later. He wrote that giving me the spare key that night, even in anger, even as a kind of punishment in the moment, was the only door he knew how to leave open without your mother watching him do it. He wrote, in the last line I read out loud that day, that the house on Birch Street and everything in that lockbox were mine, free and separate from whatever else the estate divided, because I was the only one of his 2 children he'd never once had to worry about lying to him about a number. The rest of the estate, the store, the equity, what remained after debts, was placed in a restricted trust, administered by an independent trustee at a firm in the county seat, not my mother, not me, earmarked for Dominic on the specific condition that he complete and maintain a minimum of 1 year in an accredited treatment program before a single dollar could be released, with the remaining balance paid out afterward in small, fixed monthly amounts rather than a lump sum, structured, Priya explained, specifically so no single number large enough to gamble away could ever again be handed over on a Sunday night in front of 30 relatives. My mother received the house on Elm Street she and my father had lived in for 3 decades, along with a modest cash reserve, enough to live comfortably, but nothing close to what I think she'd quietly hoped a hardware store's worth of equity might amount to. Nobody in that back room said anything for a long time. I counted 17 seconds of it before my mother finally spoke, and what she said was not an apology. It was a question about whether the trustee's decision could be appealed. I told her that wasn't something I controlled, and that I was done being the person this family called when they needed a number solved. If you've ever found out, after it was too late to say thank you, that somebody loved you the only way they knew how, in silence, in a locked box, in a deed nobody explained, I don't think there's a clean word for what that feels like. I don't think grief and relief are supposed to sit in the same chest at the same time, but they did, for weeks. And if that's ever happened to you, tell me about it, because it helped me more than you'd guess to know I wasn't the only one carrying both at once. We left the lawyer's office a little after 4 in the afternoon. My mother did not hug me on the way out. Dominic caught me by my car and said only 4 words, "I'm sorry, Elena. Truly." I told him I believed he meant it in that moment, the same way I'd believed it 6 times before, and that this time, meaning it wasn't going to be enough on its own. He nodded. And that was the last thing either of us said that day. Months passed. Marcus and I moved into the house on Birch Street that fall, repainted the kitchen my father had installed with his own hands, a pale, unfussy yellow he would have called practical. And for the first time in over a decade, I slept in a building connected to my family without dreading what the next phone call from them would cost me. My mother sent one message, 3 weeks after the reading, a single flat text that read only, "I hope you're happy with how this turned out," and nothing since. No call on my birthday. No card at Christmas. I let that be the last word she gets in this story, because that's the honest ending, not a warm one, and I'd rather tell you the truth than a tidier version of it. Dominic called me in April, 8 months after we opened that lockbox. He told me he'd completed 90 days inpatient, was 6 weeks into outpatient, and had, for the first time since he was 22 years old, gone an entire quarter without placing a single bet, a fact he stated the way you'd report any other hard-won number, carefully, like he still couldn't quite believe it belonged to him. He didn't ask me for anything. He asked if we could talk sometime, just talk, no numbers involved. I told him yes, cautiously, on my terms. We started with phone calls, twice a month, 15 minutes at first, then closer to an hour, no visits yet, no money, no promises bigger than the ones either of us could actually keep. It's slow. It's supposed to be slow. Some doors you don't throw back open just because someone finally knocked correctly the first time. I visited my father's grave once, alone, that first winter, before the snow made the cemetery road impassable. I didn't bring flowers. I brought a butterscotch candy from a bag I'd bought on the way, the same kind he used to keep by the register, and I set it on top of the headstone and stood there for a while not saying anything in particular, because I still didn't fully know what I wanted to say to a man who'd loved me the only way he apparently knew how, which was badly in public and carefully in private, and I'm not sure 5 minutes standing over a headstone is enough time to sort a thing like that out. Maybe it never fully will be. I go back sometimes now, a few times a year, and I always bring the same candy, and I've stopped expecting the visits to resolve anything. They don't need to still matter. Marcus and I talk about kids again now, in the way you talk about something once the house you'd be raising them in finally feels steady enough to hold the conversation. We haven't decided anything yet, but it's a different kind of quiet than the one we used to sit in on Sunday nights after my parents' table, the kind that isn't waiting for the next phone call to ruin it. Last Sunday, Marcus made green chile enchiladas, the same recipe he's been bringing me for 11 years. Except this time we made them together, in our own kitchen, on Birch Street, with the windows open and nobody clapping for anything ugly at our table. My father's old work gloves are still in the shed out back. I haven't been able to throw them out yet, and I've stopped pretending to myself that I'm going to anytime soon. I still keep a folder, if you're wondering. Old habits don't leave just because the reason for them changes. It's a different color now, and what's inside it is mostly ordinary things, receipts for the house, records for work, nothing that costs anyone anything to read. The spare key doesn't live on my ring anymore either. It hangs on a hook by our own front door now, next to Marcus's, in a house nobody can throw me out of, which is a small thing maybe, but it took me 36 years to have it, so I don't think small is the right word for it at all. That's my story. 11 years, 6 wire transfers, $148,545 I gave, and one I finally didn't, and a single brass key that turned out to open something a lot smaller and a lot more honest than any safe. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from all of it, it's this. Sometimes the people who hurt you loudest are still, quietly, in ways you won't understand until it's too late to thank them, trying to leave a door open for you. That doesn't excuse the door they slammed. It just means both things can be true. Family isn't a debt you're born owing. It's something you get to decide, on your own terms, who still gets a key to, and how many times they have to prove they deserve one before you hand it over again. I'll say this too, because I think it matters as much as anything else in this story. I don't regret the 11 years I spent covering for my brother, not entirely, because they taught me exactly how much I was capable of giving before I finally learned where my own line was. I just wish I'd found that line sooner. If you're still looking for yours, I hope you find it before it costs you what mine cost me. If this story hit close to home, I'd like to hear yours. Tell me in the comments what your version of the spare key was, what it looked like, what it opened when you finally understood it, and where you're watching from tonight. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, but only if it actually earned that from you. That's my story, and I'll see you in the next one.